Okay, now we're recording. All right, and I'm back with Joanna Parypinski. Is that how that's pronounced?
Yes, it is.
Awesome. And you're the author of the story. Now it's completely escaped my memory. I knew I should have looked it up before. uh,
That's okay.
Amalgam, right? Amalgam?
Amalgam. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting old and I'm getting into that brain fog where I lose nouns every now and again. And it's the thing, the thing. So so Amalgam is your story for Not Just a Pretty Face, Women of Horror, Volume 1, from Deadlight Publishing. And welcome. I don't know if it's a show exactly, but this is the fifth or sixth one of these that I've done. So having a good time. How are you tonight?
Great.
Good.
Good. Yeah, I mean, it's existing in quarantine pretty much.
How have you been passing your time in quarantine?
Well, I teach at a local college, so luckily I've still been working, and the semester's not over yet. So I've been doing that. I've been trying to write. Aside from that, just trying to get out and take walks, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's funny when you hear all the reports of COVID. Mm, Going outside is good. Staying inside and recycling your air is not so good. So I'm
Yeah.
glad you're getting to get out. What is it? Okay, so we'll start with the proper questions. What Now you obviously write horror, and I've heard a few whispers about how great your horror writing is. What is it about horror that draws you as a writer?
I think I don't know. I've always really just been drawn to the macabre. There's something oddly captivating about it. So I've always been really into more of the atmospheric, the gothic. Um, it even makes me think of why I loved Halloween, even as a kid. I didn't love Halloween because of the candy or the staying up late. I loved it because of the creepy atmosphere and a celebration of creepiness. Um, Actually, a couple of years ago for Halloween, I dressed up as the Babadook, and I had the whole top hat and face paint, and I had this like big painted mouth. And I remember we were driving back from a bar. My husband was driving, and I'm sitting there. We pull up to a stoplight, and a car pulls up next to us, and it's an older couple. And I just slowly turned and looked at them out the window, and they visibly startled when they saw me. And it just gives me such pleasure to creep people out. So I don't know where that comes from. It's just always been something I've been drawn to.
Well, your story, Amalgam, was certainly pretty creepy. I mean, first the implication of what the guy was doing, and then what happened as you started to get through the story. It just got more and more horrifying. That I don't want to give too much away, but it was a pretty awful story, and it was so much fun to read for that reason. And I agree with you. It's fun to be creeped out sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, that Amalgam, I would say, is one of my more disturbing stories, which is great.
Yeah. And the other thing that I liked about it too is it plays around with ideas of women's bodies being objects of lust and the male gaze, but never the full person, just the little bits at a time that they're looking at as something desirable, and then trying to force them together into this perfect thing. And even when you see magazine covers that have been completely redone, it's not even an actual person under there. And I thought it was really interesting the way that you played around with that and with concepts of femininity and desirability.
Yeah, there was definitely, I mean, inspired by, I guess, Frankenstein and the idea of trying to create the perfect specimen of humanity and how that goes so horribly awry. And yes, I was definitely thinking a lot about that, the male gaze, and that desire to almost craft the perfect woman through, like you said, different body parts. That was always the creepiest element of Frankenstein to me, the idea of creating a person based on these hodgepodge pieces. So yeah, that was kind of the inspiration for that story.
Yes, and I mean, it did not turn out well for that guy. Not at all.
No.
What are some of your influences while you were while I was talking about that idea of the male gaze? I was thinking about I read an article about how Hitchcock he was obsessed and fascinated by these cool, icy, distant blondes that he could never have, and that's why they always came to such violent ends, because he couldn't have them. And so, what do you consider, some of your influences for writing this kind of stuff and these, male gazy kind of uh, objectifying women? What would you consider other inspirations? That you mentioned Frankenstein. Anything else in there?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question in terms of the male gaze and femininity type themes. And I can't think of a specific influence that I have that really relates to that. I have some sort of general, writers who always influence me. Shirley Jackson is a really major influence, and I have a Gothic novel coming out later this year that is definitely influenced by We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which I love, by her. And she does a lot of interesting stuff too with gender and exploring feminine roles in the context of horror. And I think that my story Amalgam is actually somewhat unusual for me because it's more grotesque and body horror than what I typically write. So I don't think that a lot of my favorite influences even really do that kind of extreme body horror. Although as I'm thinking some, Carmen Maria Machado and Gwendolyn Keast, I think, is, both of them have written really interesting female body horror, which is really cool. So maybe those were subconsciously influencing me as well. There's just so much out there, and I feel like almost every time I pick up a book that I enjoy, it inspires me to want to create something new. But those are, I guess, Shirley Jackson, definitely, Mary Shelley. Ray Bradbury is also an influence, although I guess it doesn't necessarily compute with my story for this, but his style of writing is so beautiful, and I think I'm really drawn to that as well. And character building like Ramsey Campbell does. So I like to take kind of bits and pieces from all my different inspirations.
Your
Kind of
own
like
amalgam.
the guy in the story.
Well, I think we all do, and before we find our own voice, we tend to explore a lot of different styles and different subject matters, and but I think you definitely make it your own. Especially, I mean, I haven't read too much more of I don't think I've read anything else of yours other than this story, but I really enjoyed it for that reason. What other? Do you have any? You mentioned you've got a novel coming out. What else have you got on the go?
Yeah, so well, my upcoming novel is called It Will Just Be Us, and I'm publishing that as Joe Kaplan. So I've got two names now. That's coming out this September from Crooked Lane Books. So I'm really excited about that. And right now I'm kind of focusing on just trying to get the word out. It's kind of hard with everybody being locked down at home, but hopefully when we open back up, I'll be able to do book signings and things. Last year, I actually have a copy of I have a book that came out last year, Dark Carnival. I don't know if you can really see it.
I keep writing down everybody's.
Yeah, this one came out last summer, and it's more of I guess maybe a little more Stephen King-ish. There's a small town, there's a death cult, there's a mysterious traveling carnival, there's drugs, all the good stuff.
Yeah.
And as for what I'm up to right now, I'm a little over halfway through my next novel, which is a historical horror story, kind of inspired by what Alma Katsu has been doing with that genre, with the hunger And I haven't read The Deep yet, but I've heard good things. But she does a lot with that cool kind of historical horror. So I'm kind of dipping my toes into that, seeing how it works.
Yeah. Do you like writing the short stories or the longer stories better? I know there's definitely some writers have a preference, some don't.
Yeah, I kind of go back and forth. I feel like when I started out, I was very much about writing novels. And once I kind of discovered like really great works of short fiction and kind of found my footing in that, I really fell in love with the short form. And I feel like for the last couple of years, I've been really enjoying that. And I'm excited to have stories in anthologies like this one. I've got some stories in Nightmare Magazine and Black Static. So it was exciting to see my short fiction start to get somewhere. But the last couple of months, I've been really just focusing on novel writing. I don't know if I'm just haven't had any ideas, or I don't know. The short stories are a little dry right now, but I'm sure they'll come back. But I really love both forms I guess, for different reasons. I love the immersiveness of a novel and just being in that story for such a long time. But I feel like I can be a lot more experimental with short fiction. And I feel like Amalgam had some experimental narration that I hadn't done before. So yeah, I love both.
Yeah. Yeah, I enjoyed that too, that it played around a lot with the space and with the way that the sentences were structured, even just the way you look at it on the page. It wasn't all one thing. It played with some other types of language and images and that lent to what was happening in the story. I really appreciated that as well. Our my formatter didn't like it very much. He's like, "Is that the way it's supposed to be?"
Whoops.
Yeah, that's what it's supposed to be. At least it
You know
wasn't
whose
poetry.
formatter I feel sorry for? I feel sorry for whoever had to format that book House of Leaves, which is just like crazy experimental. It's such a cool book, but oh my gosh, I can't even imagine having to format that.
Yeah, I've heard so many things about it. I haven't read it yet. Unfortunately, it's just one of those that because you hear so much about it, you don't want to go in unless you have lots of time to, study it and
Yeah, it's wild, and it takes so much. It does take like effort to read because there's so much going on. And I feel like it's kind of a love it or hate it book. But I loved it. I don't know if I'll read it again anytime soon, but yeah.
Yeah, well, we find that too. We were talking about character earlier and how there are some books you just, can't read again. We were talking about Jack Ketchum, and I said, The Girl Next Door. I don't think I'll ever get over that one. So and then
His work is so intense.
yeah, and
Yeah.
so yeah, and that's one of the things about horror is some stories you read and you fall in love with, and other stories you read and you are appreciate having read them and just don't want to read them again.
Yeah.
So, what else do you like to read? You said you teach college. What subject do you teach? English or do you teach something else?
Yeah, I teach English. So I typically teach, freshman English, English 101, but I've also been teaching creative writing actually the last few semesters, which has been so much fun. The students are like motivated and interested and very creative, and it's been very inspiring. And I've also actually been teaching like an introductory literature course and I can sort of theme it however I want. So I've been doing Gothic horror, which has been a
Awesome.
lot of fun too. So I kind of introduced them to the classic Gothic tradition, and then I have them actually read more contemporary horror too, to see how the genre has evolved over time. And last week I just had them watch a horror movie and analyze the Gothic elements, and it was so much fun to read their write-ups.
Well, that just
So
sounded
so
fun.
that's what I teach. In terms of what I read, I love reading horror, obviously. And I like to dip into other genre fiction too, like sci-fi and fantasy. Um, but I feel like I stay pretty close to anything that has a darker slant to it. That's just always what I want to pick up.
Well, we were talking about uh, the difference between trying to be a literary writer and try and bringing in your horror stories into classes. Um,
Mm.
and I always find that I tend to read contemporary fiction, but it always tends to have a darker bent. So something like Push, which was the basis for the movie Precious, very literary, but there's so much horrifying stuff going on in it. It's at the
Mm.
heart of it. It is almost a horror novel. Or another one of my favorite novels is the Cider House Rules, which again is it's an contemporary literary fiction American storyteller. You can put it on these different shelves, but some of those 19th and 20th century abortion methods were just the most horrifying stuff I've ever read. So I think that there's a lot of crossover. But do you find that there is a difference between literary and horror writing, or?
I feel like that distinction is so much like impressed upon us just by booksellers wanting to categorize things, but it's also been ingrained in our cultural consciousness that there is such a difference between the two. And I know there are some, books and movies and whatever in the horror genre that don't have any kind of literary aim to them. They're just going for, the straight shock and gore and fun, and that's fine. But I feel like there's so much bleed between those genres, and there's so much of, I guess, what you call literary horror, but I really think of that as just great works of literature that happen to be horror, or even, like you said, with a horrific bent to them. I was just reading an article about like horror as the foundation of literature, and they were talking about how Cormac McCarthy is viewed as a pinnacle of literary fiction, and yet he wrote The Road, and he wrote all this like really horrific stuff in his fiction. So, and I think there are these authors that are not so easily categorized, or like Joyce Carol Oates. And so I feel like people want to pigeonhole one or the other, but I feel like it's just not that simple. There's so much overlap, and I feel like a great story is a great story.
Yeah, yeah, and agreed. And a lot of the time, it is just where to put it on the shelf in the library, and what Dewey Decimal. I used to work in a
Right.
library, so I remember arranging
Oh,
everything by the dots and the numbers, and so I mean, if you're that type of person that has to classify it that way, but I don't think most of us are. I mean, I always thought Cormac McCarthy was more of a Western writer than anything else. So
yeah.
classify.
I feel like there's so much genre blending there, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. All right. So I think we should probably wrap it up. When these tend to run long, they tend to be giant files, right? So it's harder to get them onto YouTube.
Yeah.
But
I get it.
appreciate the chat. And was there anything else you wanted to add or talk about tonight?
I think that's it. That's a really good chat, and thank you so much for coming up with this idea and setting this up. It's a nice opportunity to talk a little bit while we're stuck at home.
Yes, and it's great seeing you. And I hope I hope lots of people read more stories, and just invite everybody to come and watch the chat and comment and get them to read the book.
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, have a great night. Thank you for talking with us.
Thanks, you too.